Welcome back to the second episode of the Complete Slayer Guide, where today I'll be talking about the Spider Slayer. If you haven't watched the first episode, which explains the details of the Zombie Slayer and the most powerful and efficient ways to kill them, you can do so by clicking on the card now, and I do recommend it because it has a ton of useful information. However, if you're just interested in the best and cheapest ways to do the Spider Slayer throughout the early, mid, and late stages of the game, this video is the one for you. In this video, I'll be going over the basics of the Spider Slayer, covering the gear progression from the early to the late game, and going over 3 different setups that you can use that are all powerful in their own unique ways. Also, if you're interested in winning an entirely free max Hyperion, I recommend you join my Discord server. All you have to do is join, and while you're there, you might as well subscribe. And with that, let's get right into the video. First things first, same as last video, I want to go over just the basics of the Slayer itself, and then we can get into the gear. Spider Slayers, along with the other 3 Slayer types, only come in 4 different varieties, starting with Tier 1 and going up to Tier 4. Spider Slayers start with 750 health at Tier 1 and have 2.4 million health at Tier 4. In general, they mostly tend to just fight like regular spiders that jump around a lot. They will often have very strange pathing and will go in circles, but most of the time they're pretty easy to fight. They have no active abilities, but their one main ability that exists on Tier 2s, 3s, and 4s is that they decrease your healing by 50%. This healing reduction can be rather noticeable, which is why attack speed is extremely important for doing Terras, especially in the early game. The Tarantula Broodfather has a total of 8 different drops, with 4 of them being useful, which are the Toxic Arrow Poison, the Fly Swatter, the Tarantula Talisman, and the Digested Mosquito. First up is the Toxic Arrow Poison, which is arguably the most important drop of them all. This is dropped from tiers 2, 3, and 4, and the reason it's important is because it NPCs for 2,000 coins each. This means that if you drop Toxic Arrow Poison from either tier 3s or tier 4 bosses, it pays for that boss and the next 2 or 3. This means that if you drop a Toxic Arrow Poison every 2 or 3 bosses, you are going to break even just off of that. Next up is the Fly Swatter, which has 2 notable uses. The first and more obvious use of the Fly Swatter is in crafting the Fly Catcher, which is arguably the most powerful minion upgrade that you can have. However, you can also just directly NPC Fly Swatters for 500,000 coins, which is why their price is so consistent. Next up is the most valuable of the drops, and that is the Tarantula Talisman. Both the Tarantula Talisman and the Fly Swatter are dropped from tier 3s and tier 4s, and the Tarantula Talisman is a pretty good epic talisman. Epic talismans are almost always somewhat valuable, and this one goes for about 3.5 mil, and this is probably the most money you get from Terras. Last but not least is the Digested Mosquito, which is only dropped from tier 4 bosses and is used in crafting the Mosquito Bow. The Mosquito Bow is pretty bad, and so this is also a pretty useless item, and it will only go for around 450k. Now that we've talked about the bosses themselves, I want to go over the basics of the gear that you should be using in the early and mid game, but before we do that, I want to quickly remind you that only a small percent of my viewers are actually subscribed, so if you subscribe, it would really help me out a ton. Starting off, Tarantula Slayers tend to be pretty easy, with tier 1s and 2s completable in nothing more than Ender Armor and a Raider Axe. Like I mentioned earlier, healing is vastly reduced when you're doing Tarantula Slayers, so having something like a Radiant Power Orb or a Mana Flux is going to be very important in the early game, along with the Lifesteal or Siphon enchants. Most of the time, if you're doing tier 1s and 2s, you want to stay in this part of the Spider's Den and not go into the cave, because the spiders there are going to be much more dangerous. If you do end up struggling with survivability, then Tarantula Armor will be really good because it gives a ton of tank stats against spiders, and it means you can basically survive through anything. Once you unlock the Scorpion Foil, it is a pretty good weapon for its cost at only 1.5 million coins clean. However, it's important to note that it doesn't really compare to some of the other late and end game options. In general, these 3 armor sets will entirely allow you to do anything all the way up through tier 4s, but they won't be the most efficient because you won't be dealing that much damage. When it comes to pets, obviously the best pet for spawning the boss will be the Tarantula pet. It gives 40% more combat XP from the spiders, but if you don't have that, you can also always just use a wolf, which only gives you 30% more XP. In terms of killing the boss, you mostly want to use something like a black cat or another magic find pet. A griffin would work well as well, but if you need the damage, you can use something like a tiger pet. When it comes to actually spawning the boss, you have about 4 or 5 options. The first of which is the Frozen Scythe, which I talked about last video. This is what I personally use for most of my setups, but I can also occasionally use the second option, which is the Spirit Scepter. This requires a lot more mana, but it is vastly more efficient than the Frozen Scythe. Next up is the Explosive Bow, which still remains extremely prevalent after the addition of explosive explosive arrows, because the explosive arrows have a far smaller explosion radius. Next, we have the Flower of Truth, which is just obviously pretty good for spawning slayers because of its bouncing mechanic. Lastly, we have the Terminator, which I once again don't have, but it is a very good bow, especially for doing spider slayers. Now that we've gone over all of that, we can go over what is arguably the most important part of this video, which is the late and end game setups and all of their pros and cons. In my opinion, there are 3 different valid setups that you can use for doing Tarantula Slayers, with the first being a regular melee DPS setup. That means 3/4 Necron and then either a Tarantula helmet or a Warden helmet. If you're using this sort of setup, I recommend that your hotbar looks something like this. Your main DPS weapon should be either a giant sword or an emerald blade, as they will be dealing the most damage by far. In theory, you could also use a scorpion foil, but it really just isn't as efficient. The rest of your hotbar should include your main mobility, which is your aspect of the void, and then a couple of other utility items such as whatever you're going to use to spawn the boss, and then a Daedalus axe that you can hold out if you are trading bosses with somebody. I've also seen lots of people put something like a Tarantula helmet in their first slot so that when they're not spawning a boss, they can switch off and have a lot more mobility, and then once the bosses spawn, go back to the Warden helmet and kill it much faster. The next valid setup for Terras will either be 3/4 Sorrow armor with a Warden helmet or full Sorrow armor. Of course, this is mostly aimed at magic find, and if you have the DPS to be able to kill them and not die, which you most of the time should, this is going to be a very good option. If you're looking to either make the most money or lose the least amount of money possible doing Terras, I recommend that this is the setup you go for, because although it'll be a little bit slower, you will get a lot more drops. With this setup, you have basically the same hotbar as when you're using a melee DPS setup, because there really aren't very many changes. All you're doing is just using a weaker armor set that gives you more magic find. The last setup, which is arguably my favorite, is a full mage setup, and the reason that it's so powerful is because of this one weapon here, the Midas Staff. Using a Midas Staff with either a full mage talisman setup or a sheep pet while you kill bosses will allow you to one-tap them, which is very satisfying and is very, very fast. Also, using a full mage talisman setup will give you upwards of 4,000 intelligence, meaning that you can basically spam the Spirit Scepter and the Frozen Scythe and never have to worry about running out of mana. Personally, if I were just doing bosses by myself, I wouldn't go through the effort of switching over to full mage talismans, and I would just kill my boss with a sheep pet. But if you want to trade with somebody, it's much preferable to kill the boss with a tarantula pet, and so in that case, you will probably need to switch over to full mage talismans and maybe even talisman stack a little bit. Speaking of boss trading, it's very important that when you're doing Terras, if you want to be efficient, that you boss trade. Boss trading, especially for Terras, is very, very powerful, and it can mean that on average, you can have 5 or 10-second bosses, and sometimes even faster. If you do want to trade bosses with somebody, which I recommend you do, I recommend that you do it in one central area and then don't leave that area. This will prevent a lot of confusion and a lot of the downtime that can sometimes be caused by losing each other's boss. My personal favorite area to trade bosses is this little notch in the ground, just because there are so many mobs that spawn around here, and it's a very recognizable land feature. Most of the time, for late and endgame Terras, I recommend that you stick to the Tarantula pet while you're spawning, and then something like a black cat to kill, same as before. I have also seen, though, many people who will use a Tarantula pet the entire time just to level it up, and this is a decent way to make some of your money back from Tarantulas. And with that, that just about wraps it up for this video. If you have any other questions, I recommend you join my Discord server where you can ask me directly, and also right now, I'm running a giveaway for a Hyperion, which will be ending in a few hours after this video goes live, so I recommend you get in on it quick. If you did enjoy, I love reading your support down in the comments, so don't forget to put it there. I'll see you guys later, and adios.